Welcome to Healthcare Ops Wave. It's not only an acronym for how, but also healthcare operations and waves are actually very similar. Both are steady, run in cycles, and have the odd storm in between. I'm Frederik Mueller. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Third Way Health, and we'll bring you the stories that shed an inside look on the humans behind healthcare operations.
All right. Welcome. We are getting started with the Healthcare Ops Wave, and I am very excited to be here with Julie Gessin. Julie, you and I go way back, but maybe just to kick us off, can you introduce yourself and maybe tell us a little bit about your background and how you ended up in healthcare?
Absolutely. So I'm Julie Gesson. I'm the current Chief Operating Officer at Schweiger Dermatology Group. We're a dermatology and now allergy practice that started in the East Coast, and we've slowly gone down and over to the Midwest. So we're about 110 locations, about 400 medical providers, about 2,000 team members. So a lot of growth. We've been around for just over 12, 13 years. I have been there 12 and a half of those. So I think I'm employee number 7 to give perspective of what that journey has looked like for myself. And my background is as a medical provider. So I am a physician assistant by trade. I went to PA school. I met Dr. Schweiger when I was in my second year. I knew I wanted dermatology, and so I met him. He had just opened a practice, and I joined him as soon as I graduated. So it was my first sort of job in there. What I learned in going through that is, so we opened our second location in 2013, and he said, go down there, see what it's like. I'm going to stay in Midtown, and this was in Flatiron, so we were all 30 blocks away. And he said, understand how the office works and what brings in patients and, sort of what makes patients happy. And I was like, okay. And I think what he thought is I would sit in the back and I would wait for patients to come in and I would maybe ask questions, but I got really nerdy and into the technology side of it. And so I wanted to know everything about the EMR and our check-in systems and how different systems talked with other prescribing and the pharmacies and all of this stuff. And I realized that when a patient would come in to be seen, I felt like that was the distracting part of my job. And quickly realized that I think my heart and brain was better use elsewhere. And we brought on a lot more medical providers, and we actually bought our first practice 2013 to 2014 as well.
Wow.
And so that was sort of the first, we're not just going to build our own, we're going to buy some. And I was the provider that went, it was Upper East Side. So again, then we just went 30 blocks north. So we were staying in Manhattan. And I went and I thought, okay, great. I'm going to make them just like us. And I'm going to go to their office and I'm going to make them do everything that we're doing because we're doing it so well. And oh my gosh, was I so wrong, because it's a people business. It's not a technology company. It's a people business. And so the doctor had worked for 35, 40 years plus me. So I was definitely not teaching him anything about medicine. And it taught me that you can't just copy and paste what we were doing. It had, like, each of these medical practices have their own culture and history and identity. And so we had to sort of navigate how they were going to be part of our family, but also be unique. And so I would say that more than anything was the beginning of me saying, okay, this is a totally different job. Bringing people into a culture, keeping your own identity, but also acknowledging other people's. The medical providers, which is really the heart of these practices, feel like they're valued in what they bring. So I've been doing that ever since, and we've done it now like 70 times. So
I have so many questions for you, but maybe just to start us off, and I never actually asked you this, how did you end up in healthcare? Like, what motivated you to get started in that field as a provider to begin with?
yeah, so the truth is I went to the University of Michigan and I loved business. And I tried to apply to Ross Business School and I got rejected. I was like, oh, okay. And then I found sort of this in between business and sort of psychology, which I always liked psych. And it was called organizational studies, which ironically is probably exactly what I do today. And I applied to this tiny little program, organizational studies. I didn't think anybody knew about it. I was super excited about it, and I got rejected. And so I was like, okay, clearly this is not my path. I took
Rejections don't stop you though. That
no
is
organic chemistry, and I did really well. And I was like, okay. So my father's a physician. I sort of knew that, but I also knew personally I didn't want to be a physician. And it wasn't related. He's very happy in his job. I just changed my mind a lot. And I couldn't imagine picking a specialty at like 25 and 30 years old and being now my father was 70 and looking and saying, I'm going to do that same thing. You become a master of it. But I'm so the sort of following generations of like, I need to change my mind every 18 months. And so I was really afraid that I wanted to change specialties and that. So I became a PA more for that and being able to say I could see myself doing a little bit of ER and a little bit of derm and picking up a shift here and doing all these different things. I didn't realize I would cross over like completely into business versus medicine, but that's really how I got into healthcare.
And when did you, as you were sort of explaining, you were, employee number 7 at Schweiger, and now you guys are obviously at 2,000, right? What provider? Provider number 2, 1, 2, 3,
I mean, I'm the
2?
longest standing provider besides the guy whose name's on the door.
Yeah.
He's
So
in between, but he had hired a PA, and I was like, okay, maybe he'll hire a second. I don't know. Most docs don't get that big. And then he hired a second, and I was like, that's it. I got to find a job somewhere else. People don't hire more than 2. And I found out one of the PAs was leaving, and I like took her spot. Both of those PAs aren't with the practice anymore, but I thought he was done. I was like, oh, well, all right, I'll find a job somewhere else. So in my original contract with Schweiger, I have signed out like this carve out, which we both laugh at, that there's, restrictions and everything for patients and patient care. And I have this little carve out that says I can work in the ER at Cornell because I was so afraid that the practice would not get big enough to support me.
Well, it's funny how these things turn out looking back. So, when did you know that you were passionate about operations, right? So you kind of went down and started to work on the second practice and got to understand the systems and the technology and the processes. And I love that quote, patient care became a little bit of a distraction almost, but was there a point where you said, I think my path is in the operational side of the business?
Yeah, so I was at Flatiron and I was trying to come up with a systematic way to tell everyone which room each patient was in for which provider. Right now we were 3 providers. We were still small. We'd come out of the room and be like, which room am I going to? Where's my patient? And it was a mess. And I was like, well, we're looking at an EMR system that has the room numbers and has this like status. Can't we change the status to our names? So it would be like, and that my last name is Z. It started with a Z at that point. So it was JZ, JZ to C. And I called the EMR company and they were like, no, those are hard coded. You can't change those. And I was like, I don't know. They look like they could change and I don't understand why. And then I found within the EMR settings myself where they could be updated and changed. And it was this like one change I made that stuck with the practice until we went off that EMR, where every time we would have the initials of the doc and also like who they were about to see next. So it would be like JZ to see next, JZ like 1 or 2 or whatever that system was. And there's no better accomplishment I had than someone telling me that it wasn't possible and then making it possible. And I think like in that, and that was probably 2014, I was like, that's what I want to do. I want to be solving problems. I want to be solving problems at like big scale. That's not just one time, one thing. And I would say like the other pieces were I had providers who were joining the practice that would say, hey, can I get a copy of that form that you use and whatever? And I was saying, well, we should be able to make this more scalable. It's not the Julie form. And so those little moments of like doing something and making impact, I didn't ask anyone to do operations. I didn't ask for permission. But yeah, I just sort of started doing it. And someone was like, that's a job. And I was like, great, I think I'm going to do that.
And you have been seeing patients though still for a long time. Is that right?
Yeah, I still see patients twice a month, 2 Thursdays, 2 Saturdays. It's honestly, it gets me in the offices. It's so easy to not have time to do that. It's dedicated time I'm in the offices. It's dedicated time I'm with the staff. It's dedicated time talking to the managers. And I have really created a scenario for myself in the office that I sit with the assistants, I don't sit in an office. I don't sit by myself. I really, in those moments, I'm like there to be on the floor, just like a provider, seeing 30 patients with one medical assistant and doing prior authorizations and doing callback. Like I do all of that because it also gives me such perspective on what are the big unlocks. That if we could just change this thing that I'm doing 30 times a day, that would be huge value. And it keeps me close to the technology too.
I think that's a such a great example, and when I was younger, my dad is a big fan of Michelin, the tire company, and he always told me that any new manager at Michelin had to work on the factory floor and make tires for the first month, right? And I think it's easy for someone like you to just go into the operation side of the business as the practice has grown. I think it's so great and so true that you have to keep your finger on what's happening on the ground, which is maybe one of the many lessons. And I think I want to go back to something you said earlier, Julie. You said healthcare is a people business, and that was one of the big lessons you learned. Can you maybe expand on that a little bit? And specifically, how do you incorporate that the organization is growing to 2,000 people, right?
Yeah. So it's a service business. And so I look at different service businesses and what makes them successful and not successful. And it really is the people in the business and the people that their clients, their customers, their patients, what have you. And so while you could say this is like an academic business, and obviously your workforce, your sales force is medical providers. So they're highly intelligent, very smart, well trained in many ways and for many things. But at the end of the day, they can't do the job by themselves. They need medical assistants, they need front desk staff, they need managers to make sure the supplies are there. And so it's not just about the patient. The patients can come in and out, but if all of the people surrounding the business don't know why they're there, what their purpose is, feel valued, feel like it's like they're doing an important job, that if they didn't show up today, that would be a problem, and it's so, when I look at different businesses and it sort of feels interchangeable. Like I know that my medical assistant has had relationships with my patients, and they ask me like, oh, where'd she go? And I get to say, great news, she got promoted to a manager and now she's on the Upper East Side. Like they're invested. It's really a human people business, and in the small things and obviously in the big things too. So if you sort of stop at that, like we could be doing different types of medicine. We could be selling shoes. I'm glad we're not, but we could be doing a lot of different things. It's going to be about treating your providers and your staff well. They're going to treat the patients well, and the business will be successful sort of regardless of your financial goals.
How do you incorporate that as a leader, right? Talk about under people feeling aligned to the vision, understanding why they're there, the impact that they're having. How do you incorporate this into your role and how you spent your time, and especially as the organization has had such tremendous growth over the last few years?
So the first thing is I think we spend a lot of time making sure that the staff and the providers understand why their role is important. And we do that through everything from, we do daily shout outs. So anyone across the organization can submit shout outs, which may seem like they get routine, but they're so great to read every time you read them, because now you're like, oh my goodness, I didn't know we were in Mattituck, Long Island. Like someone from the Midwest doesn't know Mattituck, Long Island, but they're able to hear this story that their company. So it's the connection of people. And so we make sure that we sort of create that. And we're rolling out something called the Schweiger Way, which is true, like it's an iteration of something we had called the care habits, which is really like, how do people want to be treated? And in some ways, one of the best examples was like, we want to be friendly. And that meant so many different things to so many people. What is being friendly? Is it being bubbly? Is it being accommodating? Is it saying yes to everything? So we were really specific about what the actions that the staff wanted and should take. And it wasn't being demanding. It was setting clarity. It was saying, here's what success looks like here. And just being so transparent about what we want people to show up as in their job, what we want on sort of the back end of the delivery of the patient, making sure that everyone feels like the patient is first. And I think we could say all of this and we could do million rah-rah cheerleading things, but like our actions always defer to like what's best for the patient, what's best for our providers, and what's best for our staff. So, some people think, well, that's money and that's how you pay people. It's really not. It's like people just want to feel heard, and they want to feel that they're important, and they want to feel valued, and they want to also feel that there's growth if they want growth, or there's consistency if you want to know that I'm going to have a job for a really long time, and all of those different things. So I think the team has done a great job at keeping an ear to that and knowing what motivates.
Oh, and I think that's a great segue into a little bit your operating model as a company. And you touched on this at various points, even the example about someone now in the Midwest knowing that how you're treating patients in Long Island, and obviously as you guys are growing across more states, that's going to just become more important. So can you tell a little bit about how did the Schweiger Dermatology operating model evolve, right? And where maybe were some inflection points? And think about the operating model, about your role, about how decisions were made, how communications happened, and there's probably a few other factors that really just apply to SDG.
Yeah, so I think over time, because we had the benefit of growing, sort of, we bought a practice, we'd buy a practice. It's not like we had 100 to operate on the first day, and we had to figure out how to operate them all the same way. So over time, it's definitely changed. I think fundamentally, we started with what the journey of the patient was, and we sort of kept following that. And we've done probably 6 or 7 times, mapped the entire journey from the time the patient decides they want to visit to like the time they get their statement and have to pay their bill and everything in between. So the operating model has gone through a lot of different changes, and we're still writing it. So I think the biggest thing is it's not like sitting on a shelf, polished, done, we're done. We're still writing it, and we'll be in meetings or discussions, and we were just talking about some certifications that some of our providers need and why they need it and when they need it and how to, and we were like, that's an operating model chapter. So we talk about it openly that like we're still on these iterations of the operating model. I think the biggest inflection point was when Dr. Schweiger couldn't run the business every day in the way that he used to. And that inflection point on scale, like scale is one of the hardest inflection points that happen to businesses no matter what. And the way you want to service your customers might have to change because you're like, we handhold as we walk them this way and that way. And it's like, okay, but what if we can't? And what if that doesn't allow us? What if we can't do that anymore? So it was really about pushing down decision-making and instinct. So everyone can make a decision, but being able, not everyone, but people generally feeling empowered to make a decision, but having good instincts is really, really hard. And so we didn't want it to be all, it obviously needs to be good for patient, but it couldn't be the only thing that was good for patient because we have to have these other responsibilities back to the business. So best for the patient might be, the medical assistant drives you home, but not scalable, not best for the business. So we're sort of always saying, let's make sure we balance the two. And it's really just driving that mindset with some really clean KPIs and also sort of this fundamental, like all of these sort of buzzwords that we've used, but we've put together to say, this is what's important and this is how to prioritize that.
And so you guys are at, I think you said 110 locations at this point. So were there inflection points sort of going from 1 to 5 to 10 to 50 to 100? Is that a fair way to think about it? Or did you ever hit a point where you get to 20 clinics and then everything else is kind of the same, although because really the operating model doesn't evolve, although the organization grows?
Great question. 1 to 20 is maybe the hardest. And I think like most people know that, or else everyone that wanted growth would quickly get to 20. 1 to 20, the inflection points are, again, sort of decision making. You can't have just one person making decisions. You also can't necessarily know everyone. And we were having this conversation as a leadership team today of like seek to understand before being understood, which wasn't like a thing we were walking around saying when we were 5 and 10 offices, because we knew everyone and we sort of were all part of the decision making. Well, now there will be things that come to me and my desk or my team. I have 6 degrees of separation between me and the person that this is affecting and the way that this decision is going to affect them. I have to understand all the implications that this decision is going to make on them. And I can't possibly do that without more information. So I think my biggest moment, I was talking to a fellow COO. We were probably 50 clinics at that point, and they were, 5 maybe. And we were talking about like really sensitive stuff, end of year, bonus, raise cycle, how your decision making. And I was saying, we really had to put a process in and we had to do sort of these things. And she's like, I go around and I know and I understand. And I said, you're going to run out of scale of that really, really quickly. It's like an awful feeling to not know, but it's not my decision anymore. I've pushed down those decision making because I know that I don't know the people, and some people want different things. They really want flexibility in their schedule. They really want more money. They really want to work near home. They really want to get out at 3:00. They want to go back to school, but still have a job. Like, there's all of these different things that motivate, again, the people in the organization. There's no way I can know 2,000 stories like that, but like, I try to learn as many as I can so that when I'm understanding things, I'm like, and I don't know these people, but I'm like, have we thought about what their work and home life is? That could they get to, if we're like, we want the doctor to start at 6 a.m., my first thought is, can they be supported by staff? Can the staff get there? Do the staff have childcare? Does the staff have kids in school? Those are sort of decisions that like you wouldn't necessarily be thinking about, but because we were able to live it at a really small level, I'm able to remember those conversations. When I did want to work, I wanted to work every Saturday, and my staff was like, I don't want to work every Saturday with you. And I was like, okay, that makes a lot of sense. So it's remembering those stories.
I think it's so interesting, and we've gone not through quite the growth trajectory, but it's interesting just comparing that with our journey. And I think hearing you talk about it seems like as organizations grow, there's two things that become more important, and I don't know if they're always intuitive in that sense. One, I think, is process, right? Like I think that is intuitive. The other thing that I keep hearing over and over again, and you as well, is it's sort of the soft factors, the getting people understanding, the communication, the vision, the alignment, because you need that, because that enables you to trust others to make the right decisions, right? And I feel like you don't always hear that is becoming more and more important. You always hear about process and all the sort of hard stuff, but it feels like these soft factors become ever more important, specifically in a people business.
So one of the things that I'm an operator and I'm a problem solver. So inherently, when someone's even talking to me, I think they're asking me for advice and to solve a problem, even though like my husband would say most of the time, like, stop solving it, I'm just talking to you. And my brain doesn't know how to just like listen without getting to that next step. But it's been sort of this active control of not doing that. And it's actually something that I will watch my team solve a problem, and I will either want to speed up the solve to say like, no, we can't do that because this is actually what occurs, and sort of with just my instinct or my institutional knowledge, or I'll say, nah, I wouldn't do that. I think I'd do this, and this is why. If the more you do that, the less your team gets their own sort of confidence in decision making. And so I had to actively like wait on decisions, and it's really hard because it was like burning a hole in my email not to respond and not to jump in and not to be the solver. But I can tell a difference between people who started with me, and I think both are good for different reasons, but people who started with me where I was the decision makers still wait for me to do it first, and those that haven't seen that are like, okay, I think we should go this way. And sometimes they won't make the same decisions that I would. And as long as it's not like critical impact, I think we're going to get patient or provider or staff dissatisfiers or anything like that. Let them make small oops, because like I remember my big oops. Like I remember them, and you don't make that decision again. And so if I keep making the decisions and they don't feel those small moments, they're not going to know not to make those decisions. And I think they're confidence comes from also saying, yeah, I made that decision and it was a terrible decision. Let me tell you why I won't go back there.
Well, So much to unpack, and it's very interesting, and I love having this conversation again because we're going through a lot of the same process right now. So I feel like I'm taking mental notes as we speak. One thing that I'm curious about is how SDG and Schweiger, which is Schweiger Dermatology Group, approaches working with external partners. Obviously, that is always part and parcel to what we do at Third Way Health. Full disclosure, there's no client relationship here, but I think it's always interesting to understand, do you outsource your services or any part of it? How has that thinking evolved as the organization has grown? Because I feel like that's such a critical part to when organizations think about what is truly my core business and what do I not want to, own directly anymore.
Yeah, so we do have parts and pieces that we have outsourced. And I think there's the outsourcing piece of it. There's also the partnerships, which we have a ton of partnerships. So even if it's not outsourced, there's still a partner that's even helping us with parts and pieces, whether it be technology, whether it be servicing, whether it be efficiency, whether it be data and reporting, whether it, whatever those things are. So we have a ton of relationships with different vendors. And I think it's a partnership. And if you're not both willing to go in as a partnership and it feels like there's a balance of that, it becomes a really challenging relationship. And we've all been there where like you're a big client, they're excited to get the big client, and then it's too big of a bite. Or it's something that, now they're after the next big client and you sort of were, so we've all been in those scenarios. So I have a very unique and special relationship with my vendors where I would say like it's a little sibling like I will yell and scream and be really direct with my vendors and my partners, but there's a mutual level of respect you get to like siblings where you're like, we can do this because it's a little unconditional that like if someone asks me who's my vendor for this or how is it going, like I'm very complimentary because we can have that relationship and that partnership. And I love when vendors are like, Julie, you're wrong. Like that is not a good idea. And no one is asking for that. And sometimes they'll say no one's asking because they haven't solved that problem because they haven't even come to that problem. In other ways, I'll be like, oh, we're actually not doing that as well as I think we could be. So it's learning from both sides, but we do have some that are outsourced. I think a inflection point for us is if we ever needed to do everything in-house for our business, we could. So we don't have anything that's fully outsourced. And I think that was from COVID. Like we learned a lot just going through that, where we were very close to deciding full outsource on certain vendors. And then when COVID hit, you realize how much is out of your hands. But I also think it creates a balanced team.
And I think you mentioned this, and obviously for everyone in the audience, we started as a vendor relationship. And I remember, I think we were texting multiple times a week, and it was always, I can very much relate to that. I guess how, I think there's a lot of folks in the audience that are thinking about, well, how do my operations evolve? And there's different philosophies on some folks say, look, if it's not your core business, you should give it to someone else. Some folks say, look, hey, there's a really inherent risk in it. You have to protect yourself. There's also organizations that say, look, there's certain components of my business, even though they might be transactional, but I want full control of that because it's really important to my business. How should other operators that are going through a similar growth journey sort of weigh considerations and think about what they want to focus on and how to partner with an external vendor if they are thinking about an outsourced relationship?
So I probably cut them into what touches the customer and what doesn't. So I have very different barriers for what I expect and also what I would consider outsourcing, client-facing and not, or patient-facing and not. So on the patient-facing side, like on the non-patient-facing side, it's a little bit lower and it's probably more for efficiency, and it's to make it so that my internal team can do more at a broader scale. With that being said, and I would say this is both sides, if you do not have some subject matter expert still sitting in your bench on the side, it's going to not ever be as great of a relationship as you wanted it to be, because it's like having a marketing agency, and if you know nothing about marketing, you don't know what the metrics to look at, how to sort of checks and balance yourself and your vendor. And so
Yeah.
I think even if you have the best outsourced vendor, whether it's for marketing, for call center, for patient advocacy, for, billing, for whatever it is, you need someone internally that like understands your organization and that can also checkpoint to say, like, to pressure check where in the business it's working and it's not. And I think that's even more important when it's patient facing. So if you have a outsourced call center that you don't have someone in the middle that really understands your business, like our name is Schweiger. I've heard it said wrong. Like that's one of the first things we teach is to like say the word Schweiger appropriately because no one at Schweiger, I can't say no one today, we're 2000, but like in the beginning, no one knew a different way to say it. But now when you're big and like the organization, you hear all sorts of things. And so it's sort of having someone whose really job is responsible for overseeing that vendor and for really caring about how that relationship goes, regardless of what you decide to do.
And that rings ever more true coming from the person that enjoys pushing vendors, right, and building that sibling relationship. And so you need that. I think that's very true. So a few just general questions that I'm curious because obviously part of what we're trying to also show to the rest of the world is the the look behind humans in healthcare operations, right? So in 2 sentences or less, how do you describe your job to people outside of the healthcare industry?
I say I run a medical company that is a certain specialty, and we have 2,000 employees and about 110 offices.
It's interesting you use medical company, not medical practice. Is that a deliberate use of phrase?
It is. Most of the time when I said I run a medical practice, my father included, they thought I did the billing. They like can't conceptualize anything that's not in the four walls of a medical practice. So it's like you're not the doctor. Like I've had people say, "Oh, I run a medical practice. Oh, are you going to be the doctor one day? Like, are you looking to be like that?" In
Yeah.
many practices, is the highest point of a medical practice, and I am not going to be a doctor one day. Like, they're
Yeah.
out. So I use medical business because people sort of would assume that I'm not running just one solo like doctor's office.
That is so true. And certainly, I mean, it's maybe a debate for another day, but the I would say the importance of operations. I mean, if you go back 20 years, right, it was it was one step above the janitor, right? Like make sure that the garbage bins get emptied and now it's really evolved, right? Same with IT. IT used to be in the basement. Now you need IT to really run your business and transform it. So I think it's an interesting comparison.
Yeah, I
Um,
had someone tell me once, well, if you really wanted to be the most successful, you should have gone into sales and business development. Like that was real. That was like, if you're not doing transactions and sales, that's where all of the like fame and glory was. Yeah. And that's
well,
fine.
now
Okay
and
with
now
it.
you're selling people on your ideas and
Yeah.
concepts and visions, right? So sales is interestingly enough follows you through all the different departments. So what does the day-to-day of a Julie Gesson look like? So, can you walk us through, like, what are some of the meetings that you've held in the last week?
Yeah, a lot of my time is spent one on one with my team, and we get really deep into what they're working on, what blockers they have, what problems they're looking to solve. And so, probably by midweek, so by about Wednesday, I'm able to sort of hear these stories, put them together, and realize across the organization are three people challenged by the same thing? Are two people dealing with something that overlaps? What else from our central support do I need to pull in? So Mondays is really like all one-on-one. So I always I sort of laugh. I have these like big moment therapy meetings, but it's it's getting really deep in the business. And then by the middle of the week, I sort of understand where the business is. I take a step back. We have our senior leadership meeting. So that's where sort of our SLT leadership comes together. So probably by midweek, I sort of get the state of the union a little bit on where everybody is, what they're stuck on, what they're working on. I work midweek to sort of put a lot of those pieces together. I see patients the next day to put me back in the business. And I block most Fridays, no meetings for me to really solve the problems, work on the business, and then set up the following week. So I really give myself like one full day as best I can to set aside time really to think.
That's a great example also of an operating cadence. And, in some way, why we named this podcast the Healthcare Ops Wave, because waves are cyclical, right? And that's a lot of operations is cyclical with an occasional storm in between.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I loved hearing that cadence. So when you're thinking and working about the business, what are some of the main things you pay attention about quarter over quarter, and like how are you even thinking about the main things you look out for year over year?
Yeah, so we have really, again, metric driven. We have something called our pillars dashboard. The pillars map to our 5 pillars in our business. But so they sort of break down to, I'm looking at obviously patient visits and available hours related to patients. So if I don't create the pathway for patients to be able to book and to be seen, then we can't grow or have patients seen. So I actually spend a lot of time looking at available hours. Of course, service excellence. So patient net promoter score, patient feedback, themes, guidelines, like all of sort of those pieces. I get really deep into that because I really want to understand, is this a regional problem, across the business problem, certain provider problem, like unique visit problem? Is a patient that's always been happy and something happened? So I sort of look at that. And then I also look at, are we offering the right services? So are patients going elsewhere for certain things, and not by patient choice? It's great if they want to go do something somewhere else because they have a history with that. But like, if they're really not sure, they need Mohs surgery and they just found out they need skin cancer surgery. Like, do they know we offer it? Would they choose us for it? Making sort of those decision making. Why not? Is the doctor aware of the other services we have, even if it's not in their 4 walls? If they want hair transplant, do they know that we have a business that does that people fly in from all over the world to go see them? So I sort of look at metrics that sort of guide me to like the flight paths of the patients and saying like, everybody took off today, what happened? And again, it's cyclical. And then I think, again, towards the end of the week, I'm looking at our staff metrics, our turnover, front desk turnover, medical assistant turnover, provider hiring, like what's coming in and what's going out.
Fascinating. You look at provider satisfaction as a specific metric?
We don't measure it as much as we measure patient satisfaction. We measure employee engagement and employee satisfaction. Those surveys are really important and I think do a lot. I look at engagement. If you're engaged with the company, you're going to go to their town hall. You're going to go to their happy hour. You're going to go to their, event that they have. If you're not that engaged with your job, even if you tell me 10 out of 10, but you don't go to it's one thing to miss a few things, but if you haven't gone in 6 months, I haven't seen you, then you're probably not that engaged with what's happening at work. And on the flip side, maybe too much is happening outside of work to have you have the time and energy to be able to do that. So let's understand that more, because that's a huge unlock for you being satisfied at work.
It's interesting. I mean, and I think this is logical, but oftentimes not something that's first of mind when people think about employee engagement, is really measuring those touch points from the employee side, right? You do it in sales and customer relations. You have a CRM and you measure every touch point with a customer because that tells you the whole story. I feel like many organizations that I speak to don't really have a structured way of measuring those internal touch points, which I think, again, makes perfect sense. I guess 2 final questions. One is, you're an operator by heart now. To other operators in healthcare, what is one thing everyone should pay attention to in the next year?
Who's behind you and how are you growing them? Because so many people get so worried about being the only person that knew that thing, being the one that knows it, and they spend a lot of time on what their skill sets are, and everyone's trying to sort of go to that next level and climb to the next. I think it's look behind you, because if you haven't created the bench behind you that understands how to do those things, no one is going to push you to that next level because they're too scared about the gap that you're going to cause. So it's really, really important that you could look at someone and say, if I elevated, that person could do 95% of what I do. It's not a replacement thing, it's a growth.
That is so true. I think it's scary for a lot of people because they feel the what people say is hire folks that are much better than you at pretty much everything else, right? But it requires a certain trust, I guess, in yourself too, and that is definitely a mindset shift. Final question. Do you have a favorite healthcare statistic?
I used to have that 95% of patients buy a product within 24 hours of seeing a dermatologist. That used to be like my favorite one. I don't know if that's real anymore. It's a few years old. I bet 99% buy it and it's all on Amazon.
Wow,
Yeah,
that's a
that
good
used to
one.
be, or it takes 1 hour of paperwork for every patient seen from end to end.
Yeah, we hope that changes over time.
You too.
But
Yeah.
yeah, Jesus. Well, Julie, I know we're coming up on our time. This was great. Thank you so much. I learned a lot, and I know everyone else will learn a lot as well. And I really appreciate you taking the time and joining us today.
Thanks for chatting.
Awesome.